because it's simple. This is from one of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's reports, and I like to use it because it's a nice paradigm of a linear system. When you talk about single-use plastic water bottles, many of us on this call are probably very familiar with the troubles in the recycling industry, particularly when we talk about plastic, and the fact of how little plastic is not only being recycled, but how little of it has actually been recycled throughout the history of us creating this product of single-use plastic. There's various studies that are out there, but they all come to similar conclusions that there's preciously little plastic that's actually getting recycled. And one thing I like about this diagram is that it actually calls out how much of the recycling of plastic actually ends up into so-called closed loop recycling. So taking the plastic and turning it back into a plastic of equal value and quality. Most of what plastic that actually gets recycled is in this diagram called cascaded recycling, sort of downcycled. It's plastic that's made into a lower quality plastic, a lower quality plastic. I think what is particularly troubling for many of us is how much of this global plastic actually gets landfilled and how much of it leaks into the environment. When you think about the majority of plastic actually just going to a landfill or leaking into the environment, where it's causing all sorts of havoc as well. So when we talk about linear systems, you talk about a line going from point A to B, and our linear system is really extracting petroleum products from the earth, making them into a product that gets used once, and then sending it somewhere where it's no longer going to be recaptured. We talk about, this is a simplified version of a circular economy. This linear system, we've seen various iterations of this diagram. Take, make, dispose, production, consumption, waste. The point is that it's a line that's just moving from point A to B, and there are clear stopping points. We're not recovering those or recapturing those materials. In circular systems, and you see this is again a simplified versions of things that come from cradle to cradle and more recent circular economy designs. The reason we have this simple version is because I think it helps really identify what I find is the key element of these types of diagrams, is that this outside circle, the further away you get from the inside, you have more energy that's required to put that product back into the economy. So if you are reusing something, right, there's very little energy you need to put into it to get it back to the economy. If you're repair and manufacturing, the same thing. When you recycle something, we're actually mechanically pulling, in the most cases, mechanically pulling things apart down to their molecular level, and then putting them back together, trying to put them back together in the form that they were before. And many of us are familiar with that, is that can be very hard to do. It can be easy to do, right, on the individual level. Like we can take a piece of plastic, even in all plastic is in theory recyclable. But when you put it into a system of many different plastics, it becomes very difficult because they're all different chemical compositions. Those plastics can be combined together. It can make it very difficult. And you end up spending a lot of energy and not getting a lot back out of it from an economic perspective. So in an idealized system, circular system, recycling is sort of the end. Like it's kind of the landfill of a circular system, if you want to think of it that way. The other thing, which I think we could spend a lot more time thinking about, is this concept of recycling. I actually have a slide much later on, but I think it's something I spent a lot of time thinking about recently, is how ingrained it is for me when we think, and for many people, when you talk about sustainability, the first thing that people will talk, or environmentalism for that matter, the first thing people will mention is recycling. And we know that's a lot of an outgrowth of a lot of different educational initiatives, both from industry and from environmental movements. For many decades, we were pushing recycling. And for two different reasons, recycling was seen as sort of a panacea that we could recapture all these materials, knowing that it's possible to recapture them. That didn't necessarily mean they were being recaptured. And obviously from an industry perspective, being able to sell you more stuff with the idea that it was going to be recaptured because what they're making out of it can be recaptured was very, very attractive, even when industry knew that, practically speaking, it wasn't happening. So just the fact that still today, even for me, like recycling is one of the first things that comes in my mind when we talked about environmentalism, but just knowing it's actually in the paradigm of the system economic system we want to create, it's kind of the last and lowest value process that we want to engage in. I included this diagram when we talk about, I just like it a lot, World Resources Institute. It's a great resource if you're not familiar with it. This is a version of a Sankey diagram, which is an important tool when you're talking about industrial ecology and measurement. I added a little box up there just as a representation of, again, the linear fossil fuel system. We're putting all these inputs in on the left in terms of fossil fuels, burning them, combusting them, and then outputs we're getting gases, greenhouse gases that we really don't recapture. We know in theory they can and will be recaptured at some point by biological, natural biological processes, but theoretically the time it takes to recapture them is more time than we have. Definitions. There's no actual established definition of a circular economy, which makes the concept kind of hard at times. Is because everybody kind of does it differently. I often start, as I did here, was defining it by what it isn't. It's not linear. It is the opposite of that. But what is the opposite is dependent on where you are, who you are, and where you're located in any sort of system. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which has for a long time been thought as a thought leader and has been pushing the concept of a circular economy into the mainstream for many years, defines it. I'm just going to read my highlighted words here because I think that the operating words here, but redefining growth, decoupling economic activity from the consumption of finite resources. So actually decoupling infinite resource consumption from economic growth, and designing waste out of the system. They base it on three principles: designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use, and regenerating natural systems. We, for a while, Plant Chicago, and this is very much an outgrowth of where we were and how we operated and the system we saw ourselves in. For this facility scale, we just described it as an illustration where conventional waste streams from one process could be repurposed as an input for another. And that was very much, again, an outgrowth of being in a facility co-located with many different businesses, thinking about how that system could work together. As you expand out more to a local or a community-based level, you think about it a little bit differently. You start thinking about the practices. So we've started to define this as a collaborative economic practice sustained by local circulation of materials, nutrients, knowledge, and money. We are doing ourselves a disservice if we just focus on assets as materials and nutrients. Knowledge itself has a great deal of value, and it's often all around us as well. And the system itself is empowered by transparency, diversity, and inclusion. There we go. Sorry, I had a little burp on my screen. So this is another simplified version of when we talk about a local circular economy, having some sort of system boundary, which is, again, the challenge in this system is what is your system boundary of knowledge, money, materials, and nutrients circling within a community, however you define that community. Some selected examples. This is not a comprehensive list, But people often ask, like, what's an example of a circular economy business? And first of all, I'd say every business should be a circular economy business, but there are other things, there are different models that help facilitate it as well. And we'll go into a little bit more detail on what it's not later, but creating products that are modular. So we have examples of cell phones, cars, other products where you can take pieces of it and replace pieces of it as opposed to the entire thing. Shared use. So the sharing economy, tool libraries, other sharing platforms certainly fit within the concept of circular economy. Any product that is really not focused on selling you more stuff. So markets for used products, material and nutrient warehouses. We have great examples in Chicago. It's Rebuilding Exchange, Chicago Creative Reuse Exchange, the Waste Shed, and more of places that are warehousing materials for future use. Product as service. This is a key one. And when you're thinking about, when I use the word service, I'm not talking about like the restaurant industry. It is reframing your business from selling you a product and then no longer having responsibility for what happens to that product, but selling you the service of something. So companies that are starting to sell clothing subscriptions or leasing your pants, or leasing your lighting, where the company is selling you the service of providing you lighting or your clothing, and then still owns it. So it's something that they want to recapture and take back. So what that does is starts creating a system where businesses have more incentive to make durable products that last a long time, and also from materials that can be recaptured and that they know how to recapture. Similar along those lines and what it helps facilitate is businesses to take responsibility for the materials they create. So for a long time, we've had businesses that just create materials and say, well, it's recyclable. I've put it out into the system. It's no longer my fault. I can wipe my hands of it. And I put in parentheses there, extended producer responsibility is a potential policy that can be put in place, is making businesses responsible for the materials that they put out there in the world as well. Recapturing of materials. So all our composters and all our recyclers are certainly circular economy businesses. They're recapturing materials. They are the fungi and the bacteria of our economic system. They are actively taking nutrients and materials and turning them back into nutrients and materials that can be refed back into the economy. Any repair, reuse, remanufacture, refabricating companies. I added our friend Ramiro. Don't forget that there's a whole microeconomy of people that are recapturing materials all over the place. And I use our friend Ramiro because he's the last person I could think of that, out of many cases, that took an old TV and sold it to somebody he knows for $5, who pulls those pieces apart and repairs TVs to resell as well. There are people throughout the city who are recapturing materials on a market that we're not measuring. So think about all the people that are collecting scrap metal around the city, pallets as well. These are typically flows of materials that get ignored because there are often flows of materials that are happening in low-income communities and cities and across the world. And often these places are very good at recapturing materials and reselling them for small amounts of money. Any business that decouples its economic growth from infinite resource extraction. So if a business is sending less materials into the landfill and using downstream and using less materials, virgin materials upstream, I would consider a circular economy business. What it is and what it's not. It is not planned obsolescence. So any company that is making a product that's designed to be obsolete in 6 months you're not really a circular economy company. If you are making single use and that is your business model to build things that are used once, it's very difficult to be a circular economy company. Now, there are challenges in there, right? Especially highlighted now in the medical industry. It it makes a lot of sense to make single-use products, things that can be safe, that have been touched something and are no longer safe. You want to be able to get rid of it. However, there are options for cleaning, and that's why a lot of medical devices to be able to clean them and reuse them again. Business models meant on selling you as much stuff as possible, whether you need it or not. I just take example of even grocery stores. Grocery stores are often built on models of trying to sell you as much food as possible, whether you need it or not. Just from display models, many grocery stores are figuring out where to place things in the stores so you're more likely to buy it. Those impulse buys, right? They're not necessarily focused on the main metric of their success is their profit margin, not necessarily how much of that food makes it into the mouths of people, right? If that was a metric that the grocery store was using, they would be more likely to fall in the context of a company that's practicing circular economy throughout their organization. Growth for growth's sake, right? If your company is based on this idea of infinite growth and taking up as much of the market as possible, you are essentially, even as you make your systems more efficient, the fact that you're going to grow and keep growing means you're using more and more resources, even if you're making them more efficient. And extraction of new resources. What it is, making good products, reusing, repurposing, remanufacturing, models that prioritize social and environmental metrics alongside profits. And I added transparency there. So in the example I just used of a grocery store, being transparent of how much of your food is actually going to people and not hiding them in dumpster, the waste that goes out your door. Set a clear goal for food that's going to make it to people, or I guess in animals or energy production, and report on that publicly. Growth is a response to instead of growth for growth's sake, growth is a response to an intrinsic need in the system. So a business model where you grow in response to the need around you, thinking about composters often grow in a response to the intrinsic need in the system, instead of like pushing products on us to say like, hey, you should buy this. Because now, don't you want this? Don't you need it? Growth is decoupled from infinite resource extraction. Are car shares circular economy? Kind of, sort of, not really. People often bring that up as a potential example of circular economy. What happens though is that car shares, while there are some obvious benefits to it in terms of equity, not necessarily for the employees of car share companies, but in terms of access to transportation in cities, thinking about how now I could actually get a ride to the south or west side of the city, whereas something you probably couldn't get before. But in terms of like use and consumption, there's no evidence that car shares actually reduce the amount of vehicles on the street. Or reduce the amount of personal ownership of cars. If a car share model led to less personal ownership of cars and less overall consumption, yeah, that would fit in there, but there's no evidence as I've seen that it does. And I put in waste to energy, the euphemism for burning trash. So waste to energy would not technically fit within the model of a perfect circular economy, because you are essentially making yourself reliant on wasteful systems. You are relying on trash, and there are some Northern European countries which are now importing trash to feed their waste to energy facilities. You could, in some circles, you could consider it a transition technology, better than coal, better than extracting resources that are stored in the earth. and better to use things that are already out in the economy and already have been extracted. But at the same time, you're making yourself reliant and essentially creating a market. When you have to pay for trash, you're creating a market of waste and inefficiency. Alternatives, bike shares and tool libraries, right? So bike shares have the impact of actually less materials going out there, especially in very dense cities, of people who can utilize bike transportation, and tool libraries as well. So like shared platforms, tool libraries, meaning like they actually, you don't have to own every single tool you need to use. You can check them out from your local tool library. Anaerobic digesters, which technically would sort of fit in this waste to energy. You could call it waste to energy, but when you talk about food, that's carbon that's already in the carbon cycle as well. And you're not burning it, you're returning that material, the nutrients that are left from it, back into the agricultural system and thus the economic system as well. Waste to energy, you're not recapturing. When you're burning trash, you're not recapturing and returning that into the economy. I'll try and cruise through this. I just want to draw attention to that vernacular is important. So some things that you might find in a circular economy vernacular is, instead of using the word consumer, use the word user, because a consumer is literally like, you think about eating something, using it up, and then it's no longer useful. Whereas a user is something you do over and over again. Likewise, a common use of a key vernacular is, instead of materials, using nutrients and molecules, because nutrients, even biological or technical nutrients like metal, could be a nutrient. It's something that's replenishing as opposed to extracting. I also think this term circular economy is useful for talking to people who are not necessarily motivated by altruism or concerns for the environment. So we've all had uncomfortable Thanksgivings where you start, or other conversations with people in general, where you get focused on environmentalism and sustainability. The helpfulness of circular economy is that it forefronts the economy, with the idea that environmentalism and sustainability is embedded in it as well. And it just offers an opportunity for you to start talking to people, maybe, and finding some common ground with people that in the past maybe you've had difficulty talking to. Okay, I'll cruise through this, but Plant Chicago has gone through various iterations. A few years ago, we really realized circular economy was it could be simple on one level, but complex to understand at another, and how to enact it, and intimidating when you talk about systemic level change. So we started simplifying some of the ideas for us and small businesses that we work with. The top four practices are something that you will find across many different iterations and organizations who are talking circular economy. Materials that can be recaptured and are safe to return to the environment. Energy coming from renewable resources. Sourcing your materials and nutrients as local as possible. And also making sure that those materials and nutrients on the downstream side are recovered and recaptured as close to their sources as possible. The bottom side is really forefronting some of the social aspects of it, which can tend to get ignored when you talk about circular economy at the macro scale. So having businesses share resources and information. What is amazing now at this time is you see very large companies that are being very collaborative, sharing resources and information because they are working towards a common cause of trying to find a vaccine and create effective tests for COVID-19. And they're operating in a way that they don't normally operate, being much more transparent about what's going on, focusing on the big picture. Let's tackle this together. That's the way small businesses often operate are more likely to share with each other, to think about, hey, I found this resource, you should apply for this loan opportunity, this grant. Businesses at a smaller level just tend to be a little bit more cooperative, to put it that way. Generally speaking, it's not always the case. Businesses working together to bring economic, environmental, and social benefits to the communities where they operate. So again, when we talk about small versus large, small businesses, because of their size and often the way they operate, are very aware of the community where they operate, and as such are often well positioned to think about the benefit they are creating in the community where they operate. This isn't to say large businesses don't do that. It's just not in their face if you work somewhere remotely from where your operations are actually happening. Shared economic success. Circular economies, there's no such thing as a single circular economy company. You really, when you talk about circularity, there has to be at least two companies that are sharing resources, knowledge, information, and it's in their interest to share in economic success. And understanding that there should be equitable success. You could create a perfect circular economy systems where three gigantic companies are just exchanging resources between themselves, and only a couple of the executives at the top are receiving most of the income. So our most recent iteration of this is actually we created a circular economy toolkit for small businesses. You can find it on our website. This is just a snapshot of it, but we're using this as a way to engage the businesses in our network and our leadership network, to provide worksheets and a few other goal setting activities so small businesses can break down what they're doing and think a little bit harder about their processes, how they can become more circular. If you are interested in this, there's a link at the end of this presentation to find out more information. Some aphorisms, and this is where we're getting into the challenges and some criticisms I have of the circular economy. I included this quote from, it's an inversion of an aphorism that we're used to hearing, but instead of necessity is the mother of invention, invention is the mother of necessity. Our economy, and sometimes in our business models, are often based on inventing something that we now need. So we didn't need it until it was invented. And that's what I love about this quote. So I just threw it in there as a little provocative aphorism. In the famous JFK quote, attributed to him, and or a speechwriter, a rising tide lifts all boats. That is assuming if you have a boat, if you don't have a boat, you're in a lot of trouble. And we notice that a lot in our economy right now. There's a lot of people without boats. The tide is lifting and only a few people actually have those boats. So when we talk about this, some challenges for circular economy is talking about equity. It's something that gets left out of the conversation. The broader circular economy movement often is thinking about where does equity fit in to a circular economy. Race and culture, of course, are embedded throughout our systems, and we often sidestep it and don't talk about it a lot. I'll go back to Ramiro. There are, and where we're located in the back of the yards, there's companies all over the place that are and have been for a long time recapturing materials, refurbishing equipment. And these are small companies that have been doing it for a long time. And we can't forget that in low-income communities throughout the world, so-called developing countries, if you went to Cuba and started talking about the circular economy while they're standing next to their 1959 Studebaker, they're going to look at you like, well, we've been doing this all the time. What are you talking about? The circular economy in many ways is a first world solution to a first world problem, or a solution to an affluent solution to the problem of overabundance or perceived overabundance. Small businesses get left out a long time, and this is sort of across the world and sort of the conference community as well. They're often focused on large businesses, so small businesses often get left out of the conversation. How do we deal with open space? Can you commodify it? Should you commodify it? How do you meet community and ecosystem needs? Closed loop can also, depending on the context, be seen as resource hoarding. If you talk about how good you are at closing the loop in your business, let's take a water scarce part of the world, and you're like, hey, I'm using water really well, but you also have all of the water and you're hoarding it for yourself. There will be sections who are outside of whatever boundary you've drawn for your business or your operations and are looking at you and be like, why do you have all the resources? So closed loop can also have this this dual meaning of like, hey, being really good and efficient, but also you might feel like you're hoarding resources. Efficiency or more consumption. If you're not familiar with Jevons paradox, which essentially says the more efficient you make something, the more people will use it. So you think about, hey, I just got a Prius, that means I can drive it more. Or I didn't need a car, but now that I can buy it because I think it's green, I'm going to go buy that car. Whereas before I would have avoided the gas guzzler buying that in the first place. So efficiency, when the paradox is if you make something more efficient, it can often lead to more consumption. And then there's the big elephant in the room is that we have system boundaries. This planet can only support a certain amount of people, and we can argue about how many that is. Is it 8 billion? Is it 10 billion? But when you start getting we talk about the carrying capacity of the Earth, we're in a problem, and no amount of efficiency or reduction in consumption can solve that as well. And then there's also this underlying social side that politics, ego, and breaches of trust can completely destroy any sense of collaboration and ability to operate in circularity. A circular economy is a collaborative practice, and just like democracy, there's no perfect end state. You can only, you're like, hey, we have democracy now. It only works if everybody's actively engaged with it all the time, and it has to be collaborative. So when people start breaking that trust, it's harder to be collaborative within that. So you can't forget the human social and just our egos and how fragile they can be sometimes and how much negative impact that can have. Carrots and sticks, we'll just get into this, not a comprehensive list, but some carrots. We could provide tax incentives for refurbishing and manufacturing. We could actually provide public investment for recycling facilities, including organics facilities in the same county or country. One of the big problems with recycling right now is that we were relying on Asian markets to send all of our recycling. And now we're stuck with nowhere to put those things. Some sticks, banning food waste, restricting single-use items, carbon taxes, and extended producer responsibility, making not relying on companies to voluntarily take responsibility for the materials that create, but enforcing that on them. Some other existential questions I'll leave you with. What are the economics of free? Circular economies, when you talk about shared economies, when no money is actually exchanging hands, there's a lot of opportunity there for still having economic transactions without money changing hands. How do you measure that? What are the economics there? Reduce, reuse, recycle. I talked earlier about how industry was pushing recycling for a long time because you can clearly make money off of recycling. You can even make money off of reuse, right? But how do you make money off of reduce, right? That's a hard sell. Stop buying stuff. The money there is actually in where you're not spending your money on buying more stuff. And that's kind of harder to quantify. How can retail work in the new circular economy as retail shops shut down now? When we reopen them, or if we do reopen them, how are they going to work? Opportunities now, this time. What's my actual impact? Have you ever audited yourself? Have you sat down and looked at your trash? Now's a great time to do it because you're home all the time. My trash bin is right over here. Why do I feel busier now when I'm not even leaving the house? How is that possible? And if children are supposedly so quick to learn new technology, why are they still struggling to figure out how to get on Zoom on time? So those are my existential questions. I'm going to open it up for you right now. If you've got any answers, especially that last one, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, and again, can everybody hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. Again, a reminder for folks on the phone, it's *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute yourself to ask a question. I'll go ahead and read off the first one that was earlier. And it said, what does RX and CCRX stand for again?
Oh, yeah. So those were just a few local examples in Chicago. Rebuilding Exchange. They're a warehouse on the near north side. They recapture construction materials and resell them. They are a fellow nonprofit as well. So I think they are doing some virtual sales right now as their warehouse is closed. CCRX is the Chicago Creative Reuse Exchange, and they take in all sorts of materials, mostly for teachers. So you can donate materials that would otherwise go to the landfill. And then the waste shed as well. So this is a great spot to get little knickknacks and things that might otherwise have been thrown out. So they're creative reuse stores, and I frame them as kind of warehousing materials. They are providing physical infrastructure to warehouse materials as a transition point so things don't go to the landfill.
Thank you. We have another question from NAE, or NAE. What are the economics these days of paper and plastic recycling, given that China has stopped taking Western materials?
I don't know all the details, but from the recyclers I've talked to, the plastic situation was already bad and it got worse. From what I hear, I mean, the economics of plastic are terrible. Metal seems to be the only thing that ever has much value, and even that is pretty bad right now. But yeah, so a lot of the trouble, one of the troubles in the industry is that we have relied on places like China and India for so long and just trusted that we would send it there and they were buying it. And when China stopped buying particularly low quality plastic, and now globally with COVID-19, more overseas markets are shutting down. Recyclers don't have anywhere to send it. So the fact that we have not localized our waste recapturing is really hit us hard. And that's where I talk about there's this reluctance, right, when you talk about capitalistic markets for anyone to try and build such a facility, because it would take years to do it. And then once they did it, China could reopen again, right? So there is a huge risk to investing in it. And I personally, I think that we need to have public investment in local solutions for recapturing materials, not be relying on other countries to do it. Also, so you can guarantee better working conditions for people who work in those facilities.
Thanks. We have another question from James Christofouli. How important is using renewable energy as opposed to fossil fuels to a circular economy? Do you see that as a separate strategy or as folded into the closed loop system?
In a paradigm, an idealized circular economy system, it's only renewable energy. So because non-renewables means you're extracting new materials to make something that you can't recapture. So fossil fuels don't fit into an idealized circular economy system.
Thanks. We have another question from Nate again. How do you deal with problematic scrap yards like General Iron and Lincoln yards that do recycle but also contribute to poor air quality, et cetera?
Yeah, great question. So this gets back into, I only briefly touched on equity, but recycling and recapture materials can be a very dirty business. Just because you're recapturing the materials doesn't mean there aren't negative side effects. And that's where we get back to this idea of like not centering the conversation on, or focusing solely on recycling. So yeah, the scrap metal yards that you find, even some poorly run organics facilities as well, you have to, there has to be enforcement, but also investment in systems where you are not sending toxic dust everywhere. And a lot of it also comes down to the materials that we're putting out there. So if the materials themselves are toxic, you're creating a situation where wherever you put that thing is going to create problems, whether there's people there or not. So there is, again, in this idealized world, every community in the city would have their own facility where they're recapturing materials and dealing with the consequences of their own waste. Practically speaking, we know that's difficult. And you have to be very cognizant of not just saying recycling good, but hey, if we're going to do this recycling, how are we making sure that there's not negative environmental and social impacts around it? There's no single good answer to it other than being aware of it and making sure that question is asked every time we talk about increasing recycling. So this is a really good question.
Yeah, I agree, especially with everything going on now. That's a really good question, and that was a really good answer. The other question is, what are the paths to pivoting a career focusing in this circular economy? So things like certifications, master's degree, etc.
There are some programs now, like certificate programs I've seen in circular economy. There are also, there are lots of related fields, industrial ecology. If you, several members of our advisory committee would be great resources to reach out to if you're thinking about a more academic look at circular economy. If you're looking at sort of practical on the ground, it's getting involved or starting a business and making these practices a part of your business model and not just the bottom line profit margin. But I'm not aware of any, there's no, I'll take that back. Loyola in Chicago actually should be starting a circular economy program. I don't know if there'll be a degree, but Nancy Landrum at Loyola, Wesleyan Ashton at IIT Stewart School of Business would both be great local resources. I'm just thinking about the study of this if you're going to school. I don't know if that question was somebody talking about going to school.
Thank you. There's a few other questions about recycling, so I'll just kind of read them out loud all together. So first, how do we do better? Is there any merit in being diligent in rinsing, recycling, or using the blue bins? Also, how can we do a better job about educating people using these bins? And should this education be the responsibility of the hauler, or should it be our own individual responsibility to basically know how to recycle better?
Well, it's everybody, but I'll go back to the producer, the people who made the product in the first place. There's businesses that just put all these materials out there. And one tension we didn't actually explore within circular economy is packaging, especially when on food and food waste. Like the packaging companies will be like, well, we made this low density polyethylene plastic that is light to use, it's easy to transport, and it has lower carbon impact. It keeps food from spoiling more. And food waste, but then it doesn't get recycled, right? So yeah, some of it's consumer education, but it's also, businesses opening up, allowing you to bring your own materials in to refill things, like having more refill options at shops, right? Where you don't have to keep buying their single-use products. Is companies who make the materials that don't keep making these complex plastics that are mixed up with multiple different things. And then consumers just, just not buying it. Stop buying it. If you have a choice, don't buy it. The problem with putting all the onus on the consumer is that you don't always have an option. So, it's easy to be cynical in Chicago about recycling, but it's not, if you don't even have as much to put in the recycling in the first place, you don't have to be as cynical.
Very true. That's a good point. And then finally, I think this will be our last question. But this is a question I had, those who are kind of beginning like small businesses, and I think you pointed to a few of them through your slides, but are there resources that you can point people to if they want to start a business, but they also want to be sustainable or be part of a circular economy. Yeah, if you know any resources.
Yeah, I mean, I'll shamelessly plug our website right now, this small business section. We have the toolkit there. There's a link there, and you can request the toolkit from our small business manager, and that's one resource. I also think the Ellen MacArthur website, MacArthur Foundation in England, is a great resource. There's a lot of information there, so it's easy to get overwhelmed. But they have some very nice visuals as well as case studies to think about different businesses. I think the case study section of their website is very nice because it just gives you some ideas to way to think about some businesses are operating. So those are two good resources.
Cool. Oh, and then we have one other question. I know somebody else, Amy De La Rizzo, she put some research in here, but you might know also if you know of anyone, if you know of any zero waste stores that are opening up in Chicago.
Zero waste stores?
Yeah.
I know some people that are talking about stores that aren't ready to open, and certainly not right now. I don't think any store is opening right now. But that's a good question. There are lots. There are. Again, I'm bringing up examples of businesses that are having a difficult time right now, but thinking about restaurants as well, chefs that are very much focused on reducing their food waste. I'd say any of the local compost haulers to look into as well. Those are business models that, businesses that we certainly, if you're able to, support by signing up for the services. But zero waste stores like retail shops, no, I don't know any. That sounds like a great business opportunity. Not in Chicago, at least. Not in Chicago.
Yeah.
Yeah, there might be. There's lots of businesses, again, like Rebuilding Exchange. They're diverting materials from the landfill. So there's that. I think when you talk about zero waste, you might be talking about shops where you can refill. Is that what you're talking about?
I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was Amy. It was P. Mouthfeel that asked the question. Oh yeah, she said yes.
Okay. Yeah. I know there's smaller shops around the city that will allow you to refill with certain things as well, but I couldn't call one out for you right now.
Okay. Yeah, I don't expect you to just off the top of your head, but thank you so much, Jonathan. This was a really great presentation, especially for me personally. I've heard of circular economy, but it's kind of been one of those things that people say and I didn't quite understand. So this was really helpful in understanding that. So again, thank you for presenting, and thank you folks on the phone or on Zoom that joined us. We really hope that these sessions are still keeping people connected and they're continuing to be helpful. We'll continue through next Thursday with our Lunch and Learn series. And again, if you're not a member of IEC or you're able to give, please consider joining today using the link in the chat box. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll be back next Tuesday. And enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Happy Arbor Day.